Hey church, it's great to be with you this morning. We just want to say a welcome to all of you guys, and if you're new this morning, my name is Sam.
And I'm Pastor Michael.
And we just want to welcome you this morning. I want to kick off with a verse from Proverbs 1, and it says, "Here are the kingdom revelations, words to live by, and words of wisdom given to empower you to reign in life. Written as Proverbs by Israel's King Solomon, David's son. With these sayings will be found the revelation of wisdom and the impartation of spiritual understanding. Use them as keys to unlock the treasures of true knowledge. Those who cling to these words will receive discipline to demonstrate wisdom in every relationship and to choose what is right and just and fair." And that verse is there really as a reminder that this month we are focused in our sermon series Proverbs, and just like it says there, these Proverbs are words to live by to help us walk through these storms of life. And just there, sometimes we don't understand what's going on, but we can look to God's word and it can give us the right focus in today's world.
Yeah, and we're really looking forward to carrying on through this series of Proverbs. But before we carry on with the service, we wanted to let you know of what we've got coming up through the week that you can continue to get plugged into. And so on Tuesday evenings, we're doing Fishers of Men. That's at 7:30 on Zoom, and make sure that you get in touch with us so we can give you all the Zoom codes for that. But we're carrying on with our journey of men of the Bible and looking at these different figures in the Bible and how we can learn life lessons from those guys.
Yeah, and then Wednesday morning at 10 o'clock, we have our Victory Bible Study, where we'll be coming together on Zoom, and look out for the details through our emails and our Facebook page. And this is a Bible study on Proverbs that we're going through this month.
Yeah, and then on Thursday mornings we have Flourish, which is being led by Sylvia, and they're doing a look through the book of Ephesians, and this is going to be such a great study. I really encourage all the ladies out there. It's at 10:30 on Zoom, and I'd really encourage you to get plugged in and connect with those as well.
Yeah, and then on Thursday nights we come together for our Bible study again on Zoom, and that's at 7 o'clock, and look for the details online and you'll be hearing more about what those nights are going to be.
Yeah, and on Sunday after the service, we do a Zoom coffee and chat where we get together, talk about the week, the things that have gone on, what have been the highs, what have been the lows, and we just get to have a laugh with one another. So that's at 12 o'clock on Zoom after the service. And then what we've got coming up at the end of this month, we're going to be taking the last week of January to focus on prayer and fasting. This is something that as Victory churches around the world, we come together in the month of January to bring our focus into alignment and to find what God is telling us for the start of this year so that we can continue to walk in the path that He's calling us to. And so shortly this week you'll be seeing more details about how that week is going to look, but we're really excited to be able to take that week at the end of January to focus on the prayer and fasting. Yeah, and so now we're going to go into a time of worship, and we just really want to encourage you to take this time to bring our attention to God, to focus on Him and to praise Him and rejoice in all the good things that He's doing. In the midst of everything that is going on, we know that God is still good, we know that God is still faithful, and we know that we can rejoice and praise Him, because in worshiping Him, this is how we fight our battles. This is how we see God give us the victory in the midst of every circumstance. So we want to invite you to come and join us in worship.
Singing how marvelous, how wonderful, and my song shall ever be. How marvelous, how wonderful is my Savior's love for me. I stand His face I at last shall see. It will be my joy through the ages to sing of His love for me. We sing how marvelous, how wonderful, and my song shall ever be. How marvelous, how wonderful is my Savior's love for me. Love for me. We're singing how marvelous, how wonderful, and my song shall ever be. How marvelous, how wonderful is my Savior's love for me. Sing how marvelous, how wonderful, and my song shall ever be. Oh, how marvelous, how wonderful is my Savior's love for me. Is my Savior's love for me. Is my Savior's love for me. I will worship Your holy name. Yes, I will worship Your holy name. I will worship Your holy name. I will worship Your holy name. Oh. Bless the Lord, oh my soul, oh my soul. Worship His holy name. Sing like never before, oh my soul. I worship Your holy name. The sun comes up, it's a new day dawning. It's time to sing Your song again. Whatever may pass and whatever lies before me, let me be singing when the evening comes. Bless the Lord, oh my soul, oh my soul. Worship His holy name. Sing like never before, oh my soul. I worship Your holy name. You're rich in love and You're slow to anger. Your name is great and Your heart is kind. For all Your goodness I will keep on singing. 10,000 reasons for my heart to find. Bless the Lord, oh my soul, oh my soul. Worship His holy name. Sing like never before, oh my soul. I worship Your holy name. holy name. Worship your holy name. Oh, praise the name of the Lord our God. Oh, praise his name forevermore. For endless days we will sing your praise. Oh Lord our God. Just lift him up where you are. Oh, praise the name of the Lord our God. Oh, praise his name forevermore. For endless days we will sing your praise. Oh Lord our God. Lord our God. Oh, praise the name of the Lord our God. Oh, praise his name forevermore. For endless days we will sing your praise. Oh Lord our God. To see you high and lifted up, shining in the light of your glory. Pour out your power and love as we sing, holy, holy, holy. To see you high and lifted up, shining in the light of your glory. Pour out your power and love as we sing, holy, holy, holy. Holy, holy, holy. Holy, holy, holy. Holy, holy, holy. I wanna see you. Holy, holy, holy. This is my desire to honor you, Lord, with all my heart and worship you. All I have within me, I give you praise. All that I adore is in you. Lord, I give you my heart, give you my soul. I live for you, Lord. Every breath that I take, every moment I'm awake, Lord, have your way in me. This is my desire to honor you. Oh, Lord, with all my heart I worship you. All I have within me, I give you praise. All that I adore is in you. Lord, I give you my heart, give you my soul. I live for you alone. Every breath that I take, every moment I'm awake, Lord, have your way in me. Lord, I give you my heart, give you my soul. I live for you alone. Every breath that I take, every moment I'm awake, Lord, have your way in me. Have your way, have your way. Lord, have your way, have your way. Have your way in me.
Good morning, guys. It is great to be with you this morning. And this week we are on part 2 of our journey through the book of Proverbs. And each week we're going to be looking at a key theme that runs through the book. Last week we were looking at the theme of humility. You know, we see this come up so many times through the book of Proverbs, and it's such a foundational point for how we are to live and how we are to gain this wisdom which the book of Proverbs is filled with. The book of Proverbs, as we said last week, was written by a guy called Solomon, who wrote over 3,000 proverbs in his life, and more than 800 of those are collected together in 31 chapters for us to glean from and draw wisdom from. And all throughout these proverbs, as we read through the chapters, we see these key thoughts reappearing, these key ideas coming forward that give us a foundational point in the wisdom that we can gain from these and how we can move forward. And this week I want to tackle a subject which quite often I think gets overlooked a little bit within church. Quite often because I think our understanding of it can vary from one way to the other, and it's quite difficult to know exactly the right way to tackle this subject. But this morning I want to look at a theme that appears 14 times through the book of Proverbs, and it's the fear of the Lord. Now, as I say, quite often this is something that can be taken to either extremes, and there has to be a balance about the way in which this is addressed. If it's taken to the furthest extreme of the legalistic mindset and a condemning mindset, we see a powerful dictatorial God who wants to strike fear into the hearts of people, and if we don't obey everything that he tells us to do, then hell and damnation awaits us and all of these terrible things which are in our future. And then again, on the opposite side of that, if we go more towards the heavenly grace side of things, then we minimize this to, well, it's just a respect for God. The fear of the Lord is a respectful way of seeing God. And we almost minimize God down to the idea of being this loyal companion that is by our side and just happy to see us whenever we turn up and whenever we give him some time. He's just glad that we're around. And both of these extremes are exactly that. They're extremes. They take this idea too far one way, and there has to be a balance that we can find, because if we diminish the power of God and his desire for holiness, then we lose the key to unlocking the wisdom that God has for us. When I talk about this holiness, this is something that was really understood throughout the days of the Bible, particularly in the Old Testament. And you may have heard of the tetragram. This comes from the word Yahweh, which is a word that we use for the name of God. You may have heard it in some of the songs that we sing, and sometimes we'll bring it out in our messages. But the tetragram reduced the word Yahweh down to the 4 consonants and removed the vowels from the word Yahweh, because it was felt that the true name of God was too holy to be spoken or uttered. And in fact, by the 3rd century BC, it wasn't used at all in the Hebrew language. There was other words that began to replace it, things like Adonai or El Shaddai or Elohim. These names of God began to replace Yahweh because it was too holy. God was seen as too holy to even utter his name. There was an awe and a reverence for God, which I think we lose a little bit of today. But again, it was the extreme. It was to the point where he was so holy, so reverent, that you couldn't come near him. And one of the things that I love is that we know through what we read in the New Testament that Christ came to make a way for us so that we could draw closer to God. And Paul puts this wonderfully in Galatians chapter 4. And from verse 4 he says, "But when the fullness of time had come, God sent forth his Son, which is Jesus, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem those who were under the law, that we might receive the adoption as sons. And because you are sons, God has sent forth the Spirit of his Son into your hearts, crying out, Abba, Father." There's this change in relationship from a God whose name is too holy to utter to a God who we call Father, a God who is closer to us than we could imagine. And it says, "Therefore you are no longer a slave, but a son. And if a son, then an heir of God through Christ. But then indeed, when you do not know God, you serve those which by nature are not God's. But now, after you have known God, or rather are known by God, how is it that you turn again to the weak and beggarly elements to which you desire again to be in bondage?" And I love this verse here because he says, now that you have known God, or rather, which that word "or rather" can mean, in fact, even more importantly, that God has known you, how is it that you can turn again to these things? You know, we are called to live in a freedom of relationship with God. We're not called to live under the oppression of the law, but in that freedom which Christ bought for us. And we don't have to live afraid of God, but we do need to know how to fear him. And I want to expand on this thought a little bit of how there's a difference between being afraid of God, but knowing how to fear God. And I want to start by telling you a story. This story goes back to when I was 10 years old, and it's not a story that I'm terribly proud of, to be honest. But I was in primary school at the time, and my best friend really liked one of the girls in the class that we were in, but didn't have the confidence to actually tell her that he liked her. And so he decided that what he was going to do was he was going to write a Valentine's Day card for her. And in this card, he was going to tell her everything that he wished he could tell her in person, but he was going to put it in a card instead. And he told me that this was what he was going to do. He'd entrusted this secret into my care. And we were sat around the lunch table one day, and to this day, I don't know why I did this, but me and my best friend were there and a few others, and the girl that he was going to write the card to, and the subject of Valentine's Day must have come up. And my best friend wasn't going to say who he was writing a card to. And for some reason, the words came out of my mouth. I know who he's writing a card for. It's for Beth, the girl that was sat across the table from him. Now, what happened in the ensuing moments was that straight after this, my best friend suffered from asthma, had a panic attack, and found himself in the cupboard having to get his inhaler because he was struggling so much to cope with the overwhelming feelings that had come in because I had misused his trust and shared information that wasn't mine to give. And as I say, I'm not particularly proud of this story, but it did teach me such a valuable lesson. Was that I was, in that moment, realised that I never wanted to find myself again in a place where I misplaced someone's trust so much that they wouldn't be able to trust me again in the future, that it would hurt them so much because of what I did or what I said. And it was a fear, but not a fear of being afraid, but a fear of never wanting to find myself in that place again. And I believe that the fear of God is similar to this. It's the fear of never wanting to find ourselves in a place where we could hurt God because of the actions that we do. I think one of the ways that this is summed up really well is the story of Joshua. Joshua, if you don't know, in the book of Genesis, from Genesis chapter 37 right through to the end of the book of Genesis, it shows you the whole story of Joshua. But Joshua is sold into slavery by his brothers, sold into slavery in Egypt, and he finds himself serving in the house of a man named Potiphar. And Potiphar gives Joshua great responsibility within his house, to the point where he is the second person in his house to Potiphar. He has responsibility over all the dealings of the household. But Potiphar's wife has an eye for Joseph, and wants to invite him into her bedroom, and is desiring to have relationship with Joseph. But Joseph says this in Genesis chapter 39 and verse 9. He says, "There is no one greater in this house than I, nor has he kept back anything from me but you, because you are his wife. How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God?" Joseph puts a really interesting point here. He doesn't say, how can I do this great wickedness and sin against Potiphar, who has given me this position in his house? He says, how can I do this great wickedness and sin against God? Joseph realized that the fear of God is far greater and far more important than the fear of man. He understood that not wanting to disappoint or hurt God through his actions was far more important than anything that Potiphar or his wife could do to him. And in the end, Joseph finds himself accused of such things, thrown into prison, and spends years in jail. And yet from that, he becomes the second most powerful man in all of Egypt, second only to Pharaoh himself, because he knew how to honor God in everything that he did. Having said all that, this is how I personally would define the fear of the Lord. It is a reverent and fervent desire to do the will of an all-powerful God, that we may receive all the blessings of a personal relationship with an all-loving God. This for me is the balance of that holiness of God with the personal relationship of the Father. This is what Paul is explaining and Joseph is living out, is this desire to do God's will so that we wouldn't hurt God, so that we wouldn't disappoint him in our actions, and so that we would receive all the benefits of being in that relationship with God, because there are benefits to having this fear of God and walking in the path that he's called us to. And as I said, Proverbs brings up this phrase 14 times, and it lists some of the benefits of living in the fear of God. Firstly, in Proverbs 1 verse 7, it says, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and instruction. Again, in chapter 2 and verse 5, it says, then you will understand the fear of the Lord and find the knowledge of God. And so we can see that the first benefit of the fear of the Lord is that it is the very beginning of knowledge. It's the beginning of understanding. And so if we want this understanding, this knowledge, then we need to start by fearing God, not being cowering behind an all-dominating God, but understanding that we desire to do the thing that God has called us to do in order to serve him in the way that we best can. Secondly, it says that it is the beginning of wisdom. Proverbs 9 verse 10 says, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and the knowledge of the Holy One is understanding. And again in Proverbs 15 verse 33, it says, the fear of the Lord is the instruction of wisdom, and before honor is humility. And as I said last week, we were looking at this idea of humility, that it is living with every part of our life God-focused, God-centered. And this is the same thing when we live out the fear of the Lord, is to live with a life God-centered. And in doing that, we receive his wisdom, which is what the book of Proverbs is all about. It's his wisdom imparted into our lives. The third benefit is that it is a place of safety. And I found this one really interesting. In Proverbs 14 verse 26, it says, in the fear of the Lord there is a strong confidence, and his children will have a place of refuge. And I think this is so relevant for the season that we're in at the moment, where with everything that's going on with COVID, with this global pandemic, it feels sometimes like there is no place of safety, like we're at risk in everything that we do. But when we walk in the path that God has for us, desiring to do the very best for him, we walk in a place of safety. It reminds me of Psalm 91, where it says, he who dwells in the secret place of the Most High shall abide under the shadow of the Almighty. In other words, he who spends time in that hidden place, that place that God provides for us, will stay under the protection of an almighty God. And it's this fear of the Lord that gives us a confidence to walk out. It doesn't just say that we have a place of refuge, but from that place of refuge, we have a confidence to step out in the things that God is calling us to, because we know that we're continually walking under the shadow of the Almighty, under his protection, and in that place of refuge. And I love the idea of it's he who dwells in the secret place. This idea of a secret place is somewhere that no one or no thing can find. So nothing that is going on around us can enter into that place that God has provided for us, that place of refuge. It is completely protected by him. The next blessing of walking in the fear of God is that it brings prosperity into our lives. Proverbs 22 and verse 4 says, by humility and the fear of the Lord are riches and honor and life. This is the fullness of prosperity. And so often we think of prosperity as just the first part of that, the riches, the money. You know, we can think of prosperity meaning that we never lack when it comes to finances. But I'm going to tell you this morning that prosperity means that we never find ourselves lacking in any situation that we enter into. And so whether that be financially, whether that be, I love that honor is in there, that this fullness of prosperity is that we walk in a place of honor. And so everywhere that we enter, we bring a fullness of honor into that place. We bring a fullness of life. We can live out the fullness of the life that God has called us to, because he promises us prosperity if we will walk in the fear of the Lord. The next thing that he promises us is that it will prolong our life. In Proverbs 10 verse 27, it says, the fear of the Lord prolongs days, but the years of the wicked will be shortened. And again in Proverbs 14:27, it says, the fear of the Lord is the fountain of life, to turn one away from the snares of death. You know, every time death becomes a thought in our mind, every time the idea of something coming that would hinder our life, cut our days short, these are thoughts that can creep into our mind. Again, in this time, it's so often that there are things that go on that would make us think, God, what if this is the fullness of my time? What if I don't have much longer left? What if something happens to me? Well, the promise of God is that if we walk in the fear of the Lord, if we continue to do the things that He has called us to, desiring to fervently seek after Him, then He promises us that He will prolong our life, and not just that we would have long days, but there would be a fullness of life. In other words, that every day that we live with God would be filled with His goodness, would be filled with His righteousness. But one of the interesting things that I find in Proverbs as well, it says in Proverbs 16 verse 6, in mercy and truth, atonement is provided for iniquity, and by the fear of the Lord, one departs from evil. In other words, the fear of the Lord also brings correction into our lives. One of the statements that I find is, it says, when the fear of the Lord is lost, the things of the flesh are given authority to reign in our lives. In other words, when we lose that desire to do the very best for God in order to seek after Him and follow the plans that He has for us, when we lose that desire, the things of the flesh, the things that are around us, begin to take authority in our lives. We are empowering the flesh by neglecting the fear of the Lord. I want to read Matthew 21 and verse 12. Because in Matthew 21 and verse 12, we see a story that many of you will be familiar with. This is the story of Jesus entering into the temple where all the sellers and the traders are there. And in verse 12 it says, then Jesus went into the temple of God and drove out all those who bought and sold in the temple, and overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold doves. And he said to them, it is written, my house shall be called a house of prayer, but you have made it a den of thieves. What I love here is that Jesus lays out a very specific purpose that the temple was created for. God had a plan for the temple that was created. And here we see that it wasn't being used in the way that it's supposed to, because the fear of the Lord had left the people and they began to use the temple for fleshly things, for their own desires, for their own personal gains. But as we say, God had an original plan for this temple, and we read about this back in 1 Chronicles and chapter 22. And in 1 Chronicles chapter 22 and verse 6, David is talking to Solomon. And it says, then he, which is David, called for his son Solomon and charged him to build a house for the Lord God of Israel. And David said to Solomon, my son, as for me, it was in my mind to build a house to the name of the Lord my God. But the word of the Lord came to me, saying, you have shed much blood and have made great wars. You shall not build a house for my name, because you have shed much blood on the earth in my sight. Behold, a son shall be born to you, who shall be a man of rest, and I will give him rest from all his enemies all around. His name shall be Solomon, for I will give him peace and quietness to Israel in his days. You see, in this passage here, it details that David wasn't the right man to build the temple for God, because David had been a man of war. And I find this really interesting. I was given a book last year called Goliath Must Fall. It's written by a guy called Louis Giglio. And in it, he brings out a really interesting concept, because I don't know if you've ever been to a meeting or a conference where you've heard someone talk about the story of David and Goliath. And in that message, the person speaking will say, David was a young man filled with zeal for God and a passion to do what God had called him to. And we just need this same zeal. We need this same passion to do the things that God... And he almost tells us that we should put ourselves in the place of David. And that's certainly how I've always read the story of David and Goliath, is that it's a lesson in how we can be more like David, how we can learn from him and overcome the giants that we face, whatever those giants might be in our lives. And you might have a giant in your life this morning that you can look at and say, if I were a little bit more like David, I'd be able to overcome this giant. Whatever that giant might look like, we can look and say, if only I was like that, then I would be able to. Or God, make me more like that so that I might be able to. But one of the things that I love in this book called Goliath Must Fall is that he highlights the point that David is not the person that we should desire to be like. Because we're not called to be like David, because Christ is like David in this story. You see, Christ goes before us to fight the battles for us. Christ becomes our David. He fights on our behalf that we might have rest. 1 Samuel chapter 17 and verse 47, it's the story of David and Goliath. And in it, David says, then all the assembly shall know, he's talking to Goliath, all the assembly shall know that the Lord does not save with sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands. Again in John chapter 14 and verse 6, Jesus is speaking and he says that I am the way, the truth and the life. No one comes unto the Father except through me. You see, there's this parallel here between David and Jesus in that both of them go forward to make a way for those who are to come after us. Just like Jesus goes before us now to prepare a way, David went before Solomon to prepare that way. And when God is speaking to David in 1 Chronicles, and he says that you're not the man to build this temple because you've been a man of war who's shed much blood, this rang bells with me. Does it mean that David was acting outside of the will of God? And it really resonated in my spirit that David wasn't acting outside of the will of God, but David was doing what was necessary in order to prepare the ground for those who were to come afterwards so that they could live in that place of peace. That's what it says there, that there will be one who comes after you whose name will be peace. And it says here that we come after those to possess that which was won for us. We come after Christ to possess all of the things that Christ won for us on the cross. The thing is, when we try to fight our own battles for ourselves, then we begin to take the role of saviour in our own life story. We look at the battles that are going on around us. We look at the giants that are in front of us. And every time we try to overcome it in our own strength, we neglect the need for Christ in our life. We remove the power of salvation and we declare that I can do it in my own strength. This is why David isn't the person that we look to in this story, but David is like Christ and we come after that to possess the things. One of the things that I love in 1 Samuel chapter 17 is that you see once David had defeated Goliath, the people of Israel rose up and took the land which was now available and opened up for them. I love this idea. It says that war and peace may be able to coexist in a Jane Austen novel, but they cannot exist together in the temple of God. Just like the men and women who were trading in the temple in Matthew 21, they had an encounter with the fear of God. You know, I want you to imagine for a moment that these men and women who were in the temple, trading and making money, doing everything that they could to gain things through dishonest means, that in that moment that Jesus walks in, he begins to turn over tables. It says in the account in John that he made a whip and began to drive the people out of the temple. I don't know about you, but if I was one of them, I would be afraid, because in that moment, the flesh part, the part that is out of relationship with God, was encountering the fear of the Lord. And that was where it came to that point where everything was driven out of the temple. It says when the fear of God came in the form of Jesus, everything in the flesh had to be removed from the temple so that all that was left was what God desired for its original purpose to be. It said in Matthew 21 verse 13 that my house shall be a house of prayer. So I want to ask you a question this morning. What's in your temple? And I'm not talking about a physical building. You know, it says in 1 Corinthians chapter 6 and verse 19 that we are the temple of the Holy Spirit. And there will be a day when everything that is in us It's tested where everything in us encounters the fear of God. And I think that this is really well explained in 1 Corinthians chapter 3 and verse 11. It says, "For no other foundation can anyone lay than that which is laid, which is Christ Jesus. Now if anyone builds on this foundation with gold, silver, precious stones, wood, hay, straw, each one's work will become clear, for the day will declare it, because it will be revealed by fire, and the fire will test each one's work of what sort it is. If anyone's work which he has built on it endures, he will receive a reward. And if anyone's work is burned, he will suffer loss, but he himself will be saved, yet so as through fire. Do you not know that you are the temple of God, and that the Spirit of God dwells within you? If anyone defiles the temple of God, God will destroy him, for the temple of God is holy, which temple you are." You know, this is a really important passage, because in it we see that we are the temple of God. But when we lose the fear of God, we begin to defile the temple with the things of the flesh. When we lose that reverence and that awe for the power of God and the desire for him to walk in the way that he's called us, the things of our own life, the things of the flesh are given authority and place over God in our lives, in our temple, which is the temple of the Holy Spirit. And when we begin to fight our own battles, we lose this peace, and there is no longer a place for the work of Christ in us. As we saw, David wasn't able to build the temple because he was a man of war, preparing the way for Solomon, who would be a man of peace. And every time we look at the things that are going on around us and we choose to fight it in our own strength, we remove the place of Christ in our own lives, and the Spirit of Christ, which lives on us, loses that place within the temple that we are. Every time we try and fight it in our own strength, we begin to defile the temple, because we lose the fear of God and the trust of walking in the path that he has for us. It's like Paul said in Galatians chapter 4 and verse 9 that we read earlier. "But now, after you have known God, or rather are known by God, how is it that you turn again to the weak and beggarly elements to which you desire again to be in bondage?" You know, it's like turning back to the things that we don't need anymore. Every time we try and fight it in our own strength, we work away from the things that God has desired for us. What I love is when you carry on to read in the passage in Matthew 21, in verse 24, it says this: "After Jesus had done everything and drove the people out of the temple, and after he declared that my house shall be a house of prayer," it then goes on to say in verse 24, "Then the blind and the lame came to him in the temple, and he healed them." This came after the temple was restored to its original purpose, to be a house of prayer. And when we pray, when we worship God, and when we seek to do his will and allow Christ to fight on our behalf, we will see the miracles and the signs and the wonders. The very breakthrough that you have been longing for is released in the true revelation of the fear of the Lord. To reverently and fervently desire to do his will, the will of an all-powerful God, that we may receive all the blessings of a personal relationship with an all-loving God. I pray that out of this you would see, church, that we are called to fight our battles in a different way. We're called to walk in step with God, to fear God, and not fear him out of a sense of dread or a sense of being afraid, but to fear the thought of ever walking in a way which would bring hurt to God, because he loves us so much. And if we love him in the same way that we have that personal relationship of God our Father, then we would desire to walk in the way that he calls us to. And we wouldn't desire to pick up the battle that's going on around us. We wouldn't desire to war in ourselves, but we would look at ourselves, we would cleanse our own temple, as it were, and say, God, I want this temple to be a place of praise. I want this temple to be a place of worship, of seeking after you and praying and seeking your wisdom, your desire for my life, that I might walk in the blessings of everything that you have for me. I really believe that God wants to release some things in people's lives in this coming month. And one of the ways that we release that, one of the ways that we can open up that door from the blessings of heaven, is to walk in the fear of the Lord, to walk in that understanding of the power and the might of God and the desire that he has for each one of us to prosper in everything that we do in our lives, that we would gain all those benefits that we read from the book of Proverbs, that we would have that long life, that we would have that prosperity, that we would have wisdom and knowledge, that we would have that place of refuge, and we would have that ability to be corrected by God's Spirit, to continue to walk daily in the path that he's called us to. And I pray that we would always see Christ at the centre of everything that goes on in our lives, that we would see that he is the one that has made a way for us, that we might walk in a place of peace. God has called you to be a people of peace, not a people who are at war in our minds, not a people who are at war with our flesh or at war with the circumstances that are going on around us, but people who can stand in peace. I love the passage in Isaiah 26 where it says, he will keep him in perfect peace whose mind is stayed on him. In other words, if we fix our mind constantly on desiring to do that which God has called us to and walk in the path that God has laid out for us, then we will walk in a place of perfect peace. I pray that each one of us would find that place of peace in our daily walk. God bless, church.
Hey church, wasn't that a great word there from Pastor Michael, and full of just God's truth there from sermon series Proverbs? And it reminds me of a scripture in Isaiah where it says, the grass withers and the flowers fade, but the word of our God stands forever. And church, in Proverbs, this is the word of God, and this is wisdom for us to grab a hold of and stick near to our hearts so that we can know the true understanding of our God. And we also want to really encourage you in the next couple of weeks when we go into the prayer and fasting to really plug into that. This is just like Matt was singing in worship, the battle belongs to the Lord. And this is where we as a church come together and give him the battle and focus on him and put ourselves to the side and see what he wants us to go into 2021 with this year. And we want to see you on the Zoom call, the coffee and chat afterwards. And we hope we'll see you there, and have a great week, church. Bye-bye.